Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host Simon Wimers here. One of my writers in this case, Matt Granda, that is. There are a few Matts. He's written me a script, The Mystery of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. It's a mouthful of a title. I feel like I've heard of this one. I feel like this one's familiar to me for some reason. If you're new here, the format of the show, I've never read this before. Matt has written it for me. We're going to explore it together, dear audience. If you're watching on YouTube, this is also a podcast, by the way. Did you know? Grab it on Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. If you, I don't know, just want to listen to it, I suppose. So no, I didn't even plan to promote the podcast in the beginning of this. Or also, I mean, if you want to see my face, you can watch this on YouTube, podcast people. Let's just get into it. Ladies and gentlemen, dearest audience, let's take a journey into the past. Close your eyes for me as I lay the groundwork. For us today, Matt can't close my eyes. I got to read. You see, that's how this works, Matt. Not you, Simon. We need our favourite orator to describe the tale I'm about to tell you. So eyes wide open, please, boss. Okay, noted. Will do. It's August 1938 and we find ourselves in Cleveland, Ohio, specifically on the southwest side in an area known as Kingsbury Run. Back in the day, Cleveland had it pretty rough, to say the least. Before the Great Depression, it was a city on the rise with a booming population and economy. But as with the rest of the country, once the stock market shit the bed, the city went down the tubes. People found themselves out of work, out of money, and many people were left without a roof over their heads. Because of this, many areas of the city fell into disrepair and the homeless flocked to these areas. They built little shanty towns that were called Hoovervilles, due to many blaming the economic crisis on President Herbert Hoover. One of these places was Kingsbury Run in Cleveland, and it was soon referred to as the Hobo Jungle by many due to its vast size and population of vagabonds. Right next to Kingsbury Run was a section of the city known as the Roaring Third, a place known for its bars, gambling dens, and brothels. Much of the time, the vagrants of the Hobo Jungle would go and spend any of the money they'd managed to collect at these enticing places, looking to get drunk, have sex, or gamble their troubles away, resulting in them plunging even further into misery and despair. Yeah, this just destroys people's lives. Like gambling addiction, it's f***ing horrible. According to some reports, it wasn't a rare sight to see many a homeless person sleeping on the streets or in alleys within the Roaring Third. We find ourselves at the start of this tale within the Hobo Jungle, surrounded by ramshackle shacks in poor condition and many poor unfortunate souls covered in dirt and dingy clothes. It had to be a heartbreaking sight, but at the time, the residents of the Roaring Third and the Hobo Jungle had more to worry about than where they were going to lay their heads down that night. A monster had been loose for several years. Many people had turned up dead, and the police didn't seem any closer to actually solving the case. Any time like this, I'm always like, it's probably more than one. I'm like, mysterious person killing people in a large area where there's probably loads of crime anyway. I think people, there's multiple crimes, multiple criminals, and they're all conflating it into one person. I feel that's usually how these things turn out. At 12:40 a.m. on the dot, on August the 18th, 1938, a squadron of 35 police officers and detectives descended on the jungle, arriving in 11 squad cars, 2 police vans, and 3 fire trucks. They loudly roused the denizens of the jungle from their sleep, and each and every home was searched high and low for any trace of a clue, any shred of evidence. The police, specifically the famed lawman and head of the investigation, Elliot Ness, I've heard of him for some reason. Was he the head of the FBI or something at some point? Are convinced that the perpetrator of these hideous acts, the beast loose in their midst, was somewhere in the encampments. They tore the homes apart and then set fire to the numerous shacks that had been erected in Kingsbury Run. In an act that has been described as cruel and draconian, Elliot Ness ordered the encampments to be razed to the ground. Perhaps this was the only way he thought he could flush out the villain he was so desperately looking for, bro. And in the meantime, you're also doing horrible things. These people are not going to have anywhere to go. They're already desperate. The beast was not found that night, nor was he ever. And it's a mystery to this day as to who the evil man was who committed these heinous deeds. The police were at a loss. Ness was at a loss, and many today are as well. There is one person who most believe could have been the culprit, but we'll get into his special brand of insanity soon enough. But now, as the shadows swallow us once again, come with me again, dear audience, as I regale you with the tale of one of the most sinister and deplorable murderers in American history. From 1935 to 1938, he struck fear into the hearts of all in Cleveland, as 12 bodies, some people say 13, were dumped in the area known as Kingsbury Run. His real name might be lost to history, but his moniker still remains to this day. This is the tale of the Cleveland Torso murders. This is the tale of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. It sounds very Jack the Ripper-esque, doesn't it? With poor people being mutilated by a mysterious person in back alleys who's never caught. Death descends on Cleveland. As already stated, Kingsbury Run was a rundown area, a dreary neighbourhood that was known to be dirty and especially dangerous. It was filled with equally rundown people, homeless and hopeless, the very definition of the dregs of society. So when a few of them start disappearing, no one really takes notice, right? It was on September the 5th, 1934, that evil began its reign over Cleveland. In the early morning of that day, a young man was walking along the shores of Lake Erie, just east of Bratenahl. It was during this walk that he came upon a grim sight. The body of a young woman, determined to be in her mid-30s, was discovered washed up on the shores of the lake. I say a body, but to be honest, I feel like I'm being generous in that phrasing, since only the lower portion of her torso was found. Her legs had been cut off at the knees. Good lord. The police swarmed the area soon after the call came in, and the area was searched for any additional clues along with the rest of the woman's remains. Sadly, no leads could be found, and only a few additional body parts belonging to the victim could be located. Her head, unfortunately, wasn't one of them. The remains themselves didn't have many answers to give either, with the only visible mark being a scar that signaled that the woman had undergone a hysterectomy, which was pretty common back in the day, and it didn't really further the investigation at all. Days passed, no new leads could be found, even when several fishermen reported to the police that around the time the body was found, they had seen several strange objects floating in the water which could very well have been body parts, and even what looked to be a head. Sadly, these parts were never seen or recovered. Get used to me saying that, Simon. There's plenty of corpses to come, where there were virtually no clues to speak of. There is one interesting detail, though, found by the Cuyahoga County coroner A.J. Pierce. The skin of the body had been oddly preserved. Tests revealed that the skin had a chemical on its surface, namely lime chloride. This works to not only preserve the skin, but also turn it red, tough, and leathery. To this very day, this poor and unfortunate soul has not been identified, only being known by the given moniker, the Lady of the Lake. Well, that's a rather nice one, considering they could have called her Leather Lady or something horrible. As a note, it should be said that the validity of including her in the admittedly large list of victims is up for debate even to this day. However, most do believe that this mystery woman was the first victim of the raging madman that would soon be plaguing the hobo jungle, and so she is seen by many to be effectively victim zero. It wasn't until a year later that the first official victim was discovered. It was September the 23rd, 1935, and that day, two teenage boys were walking along Jackass Hill. Yes, Simon, that's actually the name of the location. Yeah, but it's the past. There's a demonetizable famous street in the UK that I won't say because I'll get demonetized for saying the C word. But that street really exists. Grope C-word Street. There, the two adolescents came upon something right out of a nightmare. The decapitated corpse of a white man lying in a gully at the foot of Jackass Hill. The body was naked outside of a pair of socks on his feet, was cleaned and drained of blood, and had rope burns around both wrists. He had also been castrated. The police rushed to the scene, and soon the head of the victim was also found, drained of blood and discarded near the rest of the body. Oof, Jesus Christ, the draining of the blood's f***ing weird. After taking and examining fingerprints belonging to the victim, he was soon identified, one of only two victims who have this luxury. The victim was 29-year-old Edward Andrassy. He had for a time been an orderly in the psychiatric ward at Cleveland City Hospital, but at the time of his disappearance and death, he had been unemployed and virtually homeless. He had a criminal record and had been arrested several times for being drunk in public, fighting with locals, and carrying a concealed weapon. In his final days, he was known to frequent the dark and seedy parts of Kingsbury Run, which explains how no one seemed to take notice when he up and vanished. While performing the autopsy, the coroner found that Edward had been dead between 2 to 3 days, and that his death had been the result of hemorrhage and shock. He had been alive as his head was being cut off. Jesus Christ. This wasn't the only surprise found by police that day. Located at the foot of East 49th Street and Praha Avenue, another body was found practically right next to Edward's. It was also a white male, he'd also been beheaded, and he was also missing his manly bits. Something else the police could see was that his skin was reddish in hue and leathery to the touch, much like the Lady of the Lake's skin had been, and it seemed that all hair on his body had either been burned or shaved off. The Couldn't it have come off with the chemical? Like, I feel like something that's going to turn your skin red and leathery is also going to cause your hair to fall out, no? The coroner's report did give the police a few answers, as it was determined that the victim was around 40 years old and that he had been dead for at least 2 weeks, making him chronologically the first official victim of the monster. It was also determined that, like Edward, he had been alive when he had been decapitated. To this day, this victim is yet to be identified. He's simply known as John Doe 1, a nameless soul lost to time, likely to never regain their name. And, as the name suggests, he was only the first. It would only be months later that a new body would be found. On January the 26th, 1936, a woman came upon 2 half-bushel baskets alongside the Hart Manufacturing Building on Central Avenue near East 20th Street in Cleveland. What's a bushel basket? I thought a bushel was like a bush thing. Oh, okay. It's just a regular-ass basket. Okay, here's a bushel basket. It looks kind of like a keg. Like a small version of a keg with the top chopped off and turned into a basket. Fascinating. Great tangent there, Simon. Well done. Everyone's here for that. Opening them up, she found them filled with newspapers and body parts. The police were called, and about 10 days later, the rest of the woman's body was found in a nearby vacant lot on Orange Avenue. The only thing they never managed to recover was her head. Once the coroner was done, he concluded a few things. This time, her death was the result of a slit throat. Then the killer waited for rigor mortis to set in before cutting her up, removing her head and disposing of her as he did. Much like Edward, fingerprints were taken, and they enabled the police to identify the victim as 44-year-old Florence Genevieve Polillo. She was a waitress and barmaid, and used to live at East 32nd Street in Carnegie, right on the edge of the Roaring Third. Things weren't going too well for her, though, as she was hit by the effects of the Great Depression just as bad as anyone. To earn more money, she turned to sex work. At the time, it was unclear to the authorities if her death could be linked to the other murders. Like the dismemberment and missing head wasn't a big enough clue. Yeah, it's like, there's someone chopping. How many people are chopping people's heads off in Cleveland, police? Thankfully, these days, it's widely accepted that Florence was the third official victim of the Mad Butcher. Regardless, that's 3 victims in the span of only a few months. 2 years, if you count the Lady of the Lake. And sadly, this was just the opening act. The Mad Butcher was just getting started. Discovering the Does. Unfortunately, Simon, from this moment forward, the victims remain identified, nameless ghosts in the long and winding halls of true crime history. As such, there isn't much detail to go into about them, only about how they were found. Less than 5 months after the discovery of Florence's body, on June 4th, 1936, 2 boys were walking together close to the East 55th Street Bridge one early morning. It was a day like any other, but that's when they noticed something: a pair of discarded trousers just lying there by the bridge. Seeing as how times were tough and they weren't planning on letting a good pair of trousers go to waste, they went to pick them up. Within seconds of grabbing the pants, they discovered why they'd been thrown away. They had been used to hide the decapitated head of a young man. Dude! Can you imagine just being like, oh, look, a nice pair of trousers. Oh, I'll be having those. It's the depression. And then you just find a head inside. Now, that's like the horse head in the bed situation. With a light complexion, reddish-brown hair, and chestnut-coloured eyes, the victim appeared to be between 20 and 23 years old. It didn't take long for the police to find the rest of the body. The very next day, on June the 5th, about 1,500 feet away from the head in front of the Nickel Plate Railroad Police Building, the rest of the body was located. It was naked, about 5'10" or 11 tall, slender build, looked to weigh about 165 pounds, was drained of blood, but was relatively untouched, beside obviously missing its head. Yeah, body's pretty untouched, other than the whole missing head aspect right there. Unlike the other male victims up to this point, the killer had left his rod and family jewels alone. Upon further examination, it was found that the man had been in his 20s, his body had been cleaned, and there was no signs of drug or alcohol in his system. And like the first 2 official victims, his death had come as a result of his beheading, since he had also still been alive and aware as the blade came down on his neck. The police took fingerprints from the body and were unable to get a hit on him. So in this case, I know at the beginning I mentioned how multiple people can be responsible for similar crimes. This could just be someone who wanted to knock someone off, this bloke who's dead, and wanted to make it look like it was the act of a serial killer. And the fact that he didn't cut his man pieces off maybe indicates that that was too much for him and he just wanted to kill someone. I'd be less hesitant to ascribe this to the killer. Obviously, I'd put it under the same case, but I'd be could be looking for someone else. The victim also had 6 very distinctive tattoos on his body: a bird and a band, and the names Helen and Paul on the inner side of his left forearm, a heart and an anchor in red and blue on the outer side of his right forearm, a flag and the initials WCG on the inner side of his right forearm, a butterfly on his left shoulder, the head of the comic character Jiggs on his left ankle, and an image of Cupid on his right ankle. I feel like that's a lot of tattoos. I feel like that's definitely enough for someone to be identified. Despite this, the police were unable to get any more useful information from them either. A plaster cast of his face was taken, as well as a chart of all his tattoos, with the original mask still to this day being displayed at the Cleveland Police Museum alongside the death masks of Edward Florence and one other victim who we'll touch on shortly. To this day, John Doe 2, or the Tattooed Man, as he is now known, remains unnamed. The next victim was found only a month later. On July the 22nd, 1936, a teenage girl was taking a walk through the woods, minding her own business. While on her walk, she came across the decapitated remains of a 40-year-old white male who had been dumped near a homeless camp in the Big Creek area of Brooklyn, just west of Cleveland. At this point, if we take any lessons from this, just don't go on walks, my friends. It always leads to trouble, or at least to dead bodies. Or just don't, just stay on the path. If you see a pair of trousers, don't unwrap them. There could be a head in there. And to be honest, if I see a pair of trousers in the woods, I'm like, leaving those right where they are, because it's not the depression, and I have trousers. Thank you very much. I don't think there's a head in there, but just in case. Unlike the other bodies at that point, the body was horribly decomposed with barely anything left on it, meaning he had been killed far earlier than when he was discovered. When the police arrived, his head was found nearby, having been reduced to only a skull at this point. Along with the skull was a pair of cheaply made clothes, all covered in blood. Judging from those, along with the long, dirty hair sticking to the skull, as well as the location of the body being near a homeless settlement, it is believed that the man was likely one of the homeless that had been living in the area. Something else was discovered while experts were examining the area. Given the amount of blood that had seeped into the soil, it became clear that the victim had been killed right there, unlike the others who had been killed elsewhere and then moved to where they were later discovered. The killer, the madman, had gotten bolder. He'd simply walked up to the homeless man in the forest, murdered him, severed his head, and left, all without being seen and far from his usual hunting ground. The victim, John Doe 3, has never been identified. The next discovery came on September the 10th, 1936. A homeless man was waiting for a freight train, trying to catch a free ride. It was while he was waiting that he tripped over something, or should I say someone. It was the upper half of a man's torso, and when the police arrived, they found the lower half of the torso along with both his legs in a nearby pool of water. The man, known as John Doe 4, was in his late 20s, and his head was never recovered, though the cause of death was determined to, once again, have been decapitation. From the examination, it was concluded that the head came off in one clean strike. No hesitation, no need for another hit. This was done with confidence, with precision and know-how, the marks of a killer who was quite familiar with his work. It was also discovered that the victim's kidney, stomach, and genitals had all been removed and never found. How very ripper of you, Butcher. Bruh, why are you removing just the kidneys and the stomach? What the f*** are you doing? That's so specific. Several articles of clothing were also found in the area. A dirty felt hat, labeled Laundry's Smart Shop, Bellevue, Ohio, was found near the body with what seemed to be several blood spots at the top of it. A blood-stained blue work shirt was also found by the creek near the body, wrapped in newspaper. One thing of note is the attention this particular murder got at the time. It's been documented that over 600 people were gathered around the site of the investigation, all wanting to get a glimpse of the horrible scene. And many experts believe that of those 600 people, it's almost certain that the killer himself was watching there as well, watching the aftermath of his handiwork. Enter the untouchable. With the discovery of the 6th victim, the public was in a panic. It was more clear than ever that a monster, a serial killer, was on the loose. 6 bodies had been discovered, all in the span of a year or so, and the police were clueless. Other than the clear modus operandi, beheading and dismembering before dumping, they had nothing else to go on. Neither of the identified victims knew each other, and they had no idea who the other 4 victims even were. So no connections could be made beside them being either homeless or on hard times. So in other words, just like every other person in the country. The media didn't help either. All the newspapers around Cleveland, including the Cleveland Press, the Cleveland News, and the Cleveland Plain Dealer, reported on the cases daily, calling out the police for lack of clues and suspects. It stoked public fright and outrage because, as we all know, fear and anger sells papers. Never forget that trash press is trash. The papers did manage to do one thing, though. They gave the madman his nickname, the Mad Butcher. of Kingsbury Run. The pressure was on the police and Mayor Harold Burton to solve the case, and to do that, Burton turned to the best. He turned to Elliot Ness. Again, wondering why I know this name. I'm sure someone's like, Simon, you made a video about this guy. You talked about it for half an hour, Simon. Of course you know who he is. If that name rings any bells with you, Simon, or our dear audience, it should. Okay, there we go. Born on April the 19th, 1903 in Chicago, Illinois, Elliot Ness would grow up to become one of the most legendary law enforcement officers in American history. His biggest claim to fame was his work in taking down Al Capone. That's where I know him from. As well as busting illegal stills and breweries during the years of Prohibition. He's also, of course, known for the crack team of investigators that work directly under him, known simply as the Untouchables. Yes, all of this is incredibly familiar. This is why I know this dude. All of their efforts ended up paying the on because, as we know, Capone was eventually arrested on 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act in June 1931. Those charges themselves never pursued, but they did lead to his trial and conviction on 22 counts of tax evasion on October the 17th, 1931. Ness was even one of the men who personally escorted Capone from his jail cell to the train station, where he was then taken to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Ness and his men are the stuff of legend, with many portrayals over the years in both movies and television. Following this massive success, Ness was promoted to chief investigator of the Prohibition Bureau for Chicago. It was short-lived though, as in 1933, after Prohibition ended, he was transferred, and he moved around from state to state as an alcohol tax agent before landing in Cleveland, Ohio in 1934. He was then hired to the position of city safety director by Mayor Burton in December 1935, which gave him power and authority over both the city and police fire departments. That's a ton of power for one man, but Ness was revered and respected. His credit was good, and he believed himself up for the task. Yeah, he does sound like he's got an incredible track record, so good. At the time he was hired, the murders were already in full swing, so Mayor Burton turned to Ness, knowing his record, and said that he was personally responsible for bringing this monster into the light so that he could face justice. Mayor Burton and Coroner Pierce had a vested interest in the case, since Coroner Pierce was the man who had conducted the autopsies on every victim up to that point. Mayor Burton had even put together a group of police and other experts to discuss the case and to profile the killer in a meeting that the press dubbed a torso clinic. Press is weird sometimes, dudes. Like, why? The police department was on high alert. So much of their resources were put into solving this case that before it was over, it was considered the biggest police investigation in Cleveland's history. The case was almost exclusively handled by detectives Peter Merillo and Martin Zawelski. At this juncture, they traveled every road of the Cleveland underbelly, pulled on every loose thread they could find, and dove headfirst as far down as they could safely go into the criminal underworld, all in an effort to find the madman leaving bodies in his wake. Hell, there were even times when they would dress up as homeless men themselves, trying to look like potential targets of the killer, to not only speak with the local homeless about the situation, but perhaps draw the eye of the killer himself. Once the investigation was over, the whole police department had interviewed more than 5,000 people, with over 1,500 being spoken to by Merillo and Zawelski. Absolute legends. Yeah, they seem like they're really up to their shit. I like that. As the investigation continued, they even managed to put together a profile of the killer. Whoever the Mad Butcher was, he was psychotic, a psychopath of the highest order. But that didn't mean that he was smart or organized. The decapitation of all the victims could be seen as a way to make sure the victims were unidentified, and all of them being homeless vagabonds or those down on their luck made it even more so. They were the dregs of society, the homeless and dirty, the less dead, and he knew they wouldn't be the highest priority. The messiness of the decapitations said a lot, with authorities believing that the killer may have a private place in which he could take the victims, aside from John Doe 3, and he would kill and butcher them there. If he had such a place, he would have to be strong enough to transport their bodies to and from said place to each dump site, indicating the killer was rather large and strong. And to that point, with the precision with which each cut on the body was made, the deftness of severing the head at specific vertebrae, it was likely that the killer had some knowledge of anatomy and a keen eye for cutting meat, perhaps a butcher, a doctor, or a hunter. I'm telling you, this man is sounding more and more like Jack the Ripper the deeper we dive. I told you, it's super Jack the Ripper vibes. Sadly, regardless of the detectives' efforts, and regardless of Ness's involvement in overseeing the investigation, the bodies just kept piling up all the while. Heads continue to roll. It was February the 23rd, 1937, when the next body was found, or at least part of it was. That day, a man discovered the upper portion of a woman's torso after it had washed up on Euclid Beach on 156th Street in Bratenahl. It wasn't until 3 months later that the lower half of her torso was discovered washed up near East 30th Street. However, her legs and arms and head were never found. The autopsy, conducted this time by renowned coroner Dr. Samuel Gerber, concluded that the victim was in her mid-20s and that this time the victim hadn't been murdered by decapitation. Other than that, she had never been identified, simply being called Jane Doe 1. Now, the next victim is interesting. I can already hear you asking, interesting, Matt, how so? Well, simply because it's up for debate whether this poor soul has already been identified or not. Some believe that she has been, while others believe that no, she hasn't. She was the 8th victim of the butcher, found beneath the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge, June the 6th, 1937. It was a teenage boy who found her, minding his own business, when he spotted a human skull looking at him from the ground as if calling for help. Oh my god. How old was this kid? A teenage... This is going to haunt you forever, dude. I mean, you're probably dead now, so that's not anymore. I don't know why I said that. It's a long time ago. Of course he's dead. Next to the skull was a burlap sack, and inside was what was left of this poor, unfortunate soul. She'd been dead for over a year, rotting away in a dirty old bag, away from anyone who could have found her sooner. It was determined that she'd been a black woman, and much like plenty of the other victims, she'd been killed by beheading. Now for the identification. Officially, the victim is simply categorized as Jane Doe 2, but there has been a case made that we already know who she is. While not official, many believe that she's actually Rose Wallace, a 40-year-old African-American sex worker who had gone missing in the area 10 months prior from the exact same bar that Florence had vanished from. Now, right off the bat, it's dubious for that reason. Rose had vanished 10 months before the bones were discovered, but the bones themselves were determined to be around a year old. Some golden dental work had reportedly been identified by an individual who claimed to be Rose's son, but it was never truly verified, as the dentist who did the work had passed away years prior. So while there might be a small chance that the bones in the sack were those of Rose Wallace, to this day she remains Jane Doe 2, her death mask hanging up in the Crime Museum along with Edward, Florence, and the tattooed man. Jane Doe 5 was next found on July the 6th, 1937. Members of the National Guard had been called in to maintain order for workers at the Cleveland Flats just underneath Kingsbury Run. On that day, a young guardsman was on duty by the West 3rd Street Bridge. After a tugboat passed by, he noticed something floating in the Cuyahoga River. It turned out to be a burlap sack that contained the upper portion of a man's torso. The man is believed to have been in his late 30s, and his 2 thighs were found inside. It took a few days for the police to find the rest of the bodies, except for a few of the essentials. The body itself had... I get what that means there. It's his manly parts. The body itself had been emptied of its internal organs, including the heart, and none of them could be found, and neither could the head be found. Bruh, this guy is butchering people up. The butcher was getting more vicious, more sick, more twisted, something that didn't even seem possible. But with the constant failures of the police, the constant inability of them to be able to catch him, everything just seemed to be escalating, and he was getting much bolder with each victim, leaving them more in the open, easier to find. The destruction of the last victim seemed to satiate the killer for nearly a year, but come the summer of 1938, he needed to kill again. A worker at the flats was on his way to work on April the 8th, 1938, a normal day in the neighborhood, when he noticed what he believed to be a dead fish that had washed up on the bank at the Cuyahoga River. Even with all the press, even with the fear on the streets, I don't begrudge him for thinking it was something so mundane. I mean, who walks to work, sees something and immediately believes it to be the lower leg of a woman? That was just the first part of who would come known as Jane Doe 3. It was a month later that the police pulled 2 burlap sacks out of the river. Inside was the nude torso of the victim, and soon after, her thighs and feet were found floating down the river east of West 3rd Street Bridge. Her head and arms were never found, and like so many others, she was never identified. There was a small wrinkle, though. While examining the remains, Dr. Gerber was able to find traces of morphine in her system. This was the only victim to have anything in their system at the time of discovery, and it led to the idea that whoever this was may have been an addict. If they could find the arms, they might have their answer, but it wasn't to be. I mean, what good is that going to be, though? Okay, so they find out she was addicted to morphine. Okay, great. Well, so what? However, it does lend to a popular and widely accepted theory as to the identity of the monster, but more on that soon enough. Oh yeah, very curious how that leads to that. And with that, we come to the final victims of the Mad Butcher. As the years went by, it became clear that the madman that Ness and the police were hunting for was getting bolder, more brash, and more cocky in his killings, and where he dumped the corpses. And none were more of a taunt to the authorities than the last 2 victims. It was August 16th, 1938, 8 days since the last body was found, when 3 scrap collectors were combing the dump at the end of East 9th Street and Lakeside in Cleveland, Ohio, looking for scrap metal. It was there that they found the torso of a woman wrapped in a man's double-breasted blue blazer and an old quilt. When the police arrived, they also found arms and legs of the woman wrapped in rags, brown paper, and cardboard, and placed in a makeshift box. The head was also wrapped in the same fashion and was uncharacteristically found with the body. So, I know what you must all be thinking. So far, so normal for the butcher. So, what makes this one so special? Well, first off, it's because this body wasn't alone. While the police were searching the area, another victim was found only yards away from the first one, once again headless, and once again with his extremities all cut at the joints. When Dr. Gerber examined both bodies, he concluded that both bodies had been refrigerated, so they had been murdered months before. Oh, and they just happened to be placed right out in plain view of Elliot Ness's office window. God damn, that is a taunt and a half, isn't it? That's right, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, in what was likely a gruesome and deranged attempt to taunt and mock Ness in his efforts to catch him, placed his victims' bodies, the 11th and 12th of his victims, right there by his office window. It was as if to say, better luck next time. See if you can catch me, Mr. Ness. The obvious flaunting of his failures got to Ness, as 2 days later he orchestrated the quite frankly careless and reckless act that we began this story with today. Oh, right, the destruction of the whatever it was called, the homeless encampment. He and the 35 officers and detectives descended on the hobo jungle, that's what it was called, ripping folks from their makeshift homes, tearing them apart and torturing them in the dead of night. Oh, okay. For a minute I was like, wait, they were tearing the people in half and torturing them? But it means the houses, obviously. Use your brain, Simon. All in a vain search for the criminal who dared to mock him and dared to wave his inability in his face. A long and storied career, and because of this insane murderer, it all started to come tumbling down. His marriage fell apart, and so did the subsequent ones. He came under fire from the critics for his draconian methods, as well as his failure to catch the killer, and in the end, he left his position, unsuccessfully ran for mayor of Cleveland, and wound up having to take odd jobs as a bookstore clerk and seller of hamburgers just to sustain himself. Elliot Ness did. Whoa. Having fallen from grace so completely, Elliot Ness ended up dying of a heart attack at the age of 54 on May the 16th, 1957, penniless and mostly forgotten. Whoa! I had no idea he ended up like this. He was a big deal. Finding the butcher. The 12th victim would be his final one, and the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run seemingly disappeared. To this day, we still don't know the real name of the killer. That doesn't mean we don't know the names of the most likely suspects, though, 2 of whom are nearly always brought up. One that most assuredly didn't do it, and one that, to this day, many, myself included, believe is likely the killer. Okay. The first suspect we need to talk about is 52-year-old Frank Dolezal, a bohemian bricklayer in Cleveland and a well-known alcoholic. Police came to the understanding that Frank had actually lived with Florence Polillo at one time and had personally known Edward Andrassy and Rose Wallace. For them, that was enough, and he was arrested by County Sheriff Martin O'Donnell on the 24th of August 1939 for the murder of Florence. That day, Dolezal gave a confession, saying that he killed both Edward and Florence, the second one in self-defense. Between the incoherent mumblings and ranting, he did have very precise details about the crimes, almost too detailed. I mean, it makes sense, since it was clear as day that Dolezal had been coached with the details and that he'd been beaten to hell to get him talking in the first place. The police of the past, ladies and gentlemen, beating confessions out of suspects since the beginning of time. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's like just the police of the past. Like, confessions are coerced all the time. There's that read technique that they use to get people to confess to shit. It's like, even if you've not done it, you'll be like, yeah, I did it, stop. I want to go home, let me go home. And they're like, you're not going home, you're going to prison, son. The police were simply trying to close the case and were willing to pin it on the most likely suspect that they could find. Sadly, they never got the chance to. That same night, before he was even able to stand trial, Frank Dolezal was found hanging in his cell. A couple of notes, though, as this is quite suspicious if you ask me. First of all of the security cameras were found to have been... Nah, just joking. Obviously, that's what happened to Epstein. A couple of notes, though, as this is quite suspicious. First of all, Dolezal was found to have at least 6 broken ribs during the autopsy, so he had clearly had the shit kicked out of him. The cops really wanted that confession, and hell, he'd even recanted the confession before they left him for the night, telling anyone who could hear him that he only said it because he wanted them to stop knocking him around. And second, Dolezal was 5'8". He was found hanging from a hook only 5 feet 7 inches off the floor. To say that, dude, his tiptoes could clearly touch the floor then. He was found hanging from a hook only 5 feet 7 inches off the wall. To say this smells fishy is an understatement. Wait, so they faked him hanging himself by hanging him, and then his feet are fully on the ground. Dude, come on now. He Jeffrey Epsteined himself. Thankfully, Frank Dolezal was posthumously exonerated of any and all involvement with the killing, so if there's an afterlife waiting for us, Frank can now rest easy. I don't believe the same could be said for the next man. So let's talk about Dr. Francis Edward Frank Sweeney, or as I like to call him, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Oh, shit! And he's a doctor as well, like those kidney removal and stomach and stuff, and the vertebrae slicing was very precise. During the investigation, Ness was said to be on the trail of a man simply identified as Gaylord Sondheim. According to Ness, Gaylord was a homosexual pre-med student, as well as a is that just a coincidence that his name was Gaylord? I know that was like a common name in the past. As well as a member of the prominent Cleveland family. Putting the pieces together, and outside the homosexual point, all of that describes Dr. Francis Sweeney, who was, and still is to this day, the number one suspect, and was even named as the killer way back in 1938. Born on May 5th, 1894, Sweeney was a veteran of World War I as part of the medical unit. As a medic, he was part of the team that conducted many battlefield amputations. Sounds like a handy skill and experience to have when it comes to chopping up bodies. It's said that he also suffered nerve damage from a gas attack, which resulted in being discharged with the notation that he was 25% disabled. Afterwards, in 1929, the good doctor turned to alcohol to drown his woes, though more accurately, he was taking a drink to numb the obvious PTSD he suffered from the Great War. Yeah, he's out there doing field amputations. That is gonna give you some PTSD. It got so bad that his wife committed him for his alcoholism in 1933, which led to him losing his job, which led to his wife leaving him in 1934, with their divorce being finalized in 1936. Talk about a whirlwind of errors. But what's that got to do with the murders? Well, to be fair, most of the evidence against him is circumstantial, but there's just so much of it. In 1929, Sweeney had a job as a surgical resident at the St. Alexis Hospital in the Kingsbury Run area. This is the job he lost when he was forced into rehab by his wife. It was in 1934, the year his wife left him, that the murders began. It can be easily suggested that the downward spiral of his personal life may have caused this man of medicine to snap. Okay, I'm hoping there's a lot more circumstantial evidence than that, because that ain't a lot. Hell, in 1934, a man by the name of Emil Fronek, who had an office in the same area as Sweeney, went to the police and told them that Sweeney had attempted to drug him. When asked to show them where this happened, Emil was unable to do so, being unsure as to which building it had been. This caused his claim to be discredited instantly, despite the fact that Sweeney had an office next to a coroner in the same area where Emil had been attacked and almost drugged. And remember when I brought up the idea that the killer had a clean and private place to kill and chop up his victims? Well, there was a morgue in the coroner's office that he worked next to, and he was known to practice and said more quite frequently, being left there by himself for long periods of time. Yeah, and he probably can get away with this. He's like, I'm a doctor, I'm in there doing medicine, and such things, where he's really just like cutting out people's kidneys for fun. It's weird. Still think it's all pretty circumstantial though, Matt. Circumstantial? Absolutely. Well, there we go, same page. But there are only so many circumstances that can happen before it becomes suspicious, and Sweeney was in Ness's crosshairs. What happened next? Well, let's just say that it wasn't necessarily by the book. When Ness found Sweeney, the man was so intoxicated he needed 3 days to totally sober up. Fucking hell. Jesus. Why? It's like a 3-day... just to sober up? What came next was an illegal week-long lockup in a hotel room where Sweeney was under constant questioning and interrogation, all the while denying he had any involvement with the murders. With things going nowhere, Ness called in a favour. One day he brought in Leonard Keeler. Who is Leonard Keeler, I hear you ask? Why, he just happens to be the co-creator of the polygraph. Oh, God, polygraphs. And look, we can rag on polygraphs all we like nowadays, but back in the day, many believed it was groundbreaking technology, and who better to administer the test than the man who created it? 2 tests were administered, and according to Keeler, both were miserably failed. He was so sure that his lie detector was the best proof they could get that he looked Ness right in the face and told him that they had the guy. Sweeney was their killer, no doubt about it. However, no charges were filed, no case was pursued. This could be for several reasons. First off, technically Sweeney was being held against his will in that hotel room, unable to leave, and was being questioned non-stop for a whole week. Second, even if things started adding up, much of it was circumstantial, and there was a good chance that they either wouldn't have made it to trial or they wouldn't have been able to convict him. And third, even if they did pursue it, there was a chance it would simply be thrown out. Why? Because, as I mentioned briefly before, Sweeney was a member of a rather important family. To be specific, he was the first cousin of then US Congressman Martin L. Sweeney, a pretty powerful ally to have in your pocket, especially since the congressman was not only a political opponent of Ness, but one that had been on Ness's ass for a long time, tearing into him for not catching the killer. I think it's pretty safe to say that some could see this as a conflict of interest. Yeah, no how about you stay out of that policey business, yo? And so Sweeney was let go. But that didn't stop the suspicion from sticking to him like white on rice. In fact, it was after Sweeney was let go that the two bodies were found right in plain view of Ness's office. And if that doesn't scream payback, I don't know what does. Soon after he was let go, though, he committed himself to a veteran hospital in August 1938. He only briefly left the hospital in 1939, but wound up right back inside again, and even then, he refused to let go of what Ness did to him. While institutionalized, Sweeney repeatedly sent threatening and mean-spirited postcards to Ness and his family, making sure that he was always in the forefront of Ness's mind until his very last day. He wanted Ness to know that he failed, to know that he screwed up, and he wanted to remind him of it every single day. Dr. Francis Sweeney died on July 9th, 1964, in that same Veterans Hospital in Dayton, Ohio, at the age of 70. So yes, while myself and many others believe Sweeney to be the killer, nothing was outright proven. But as a final point, after Sweeney committed himself, the killing stopped. And that's got to count for something. Yeah, do I think it's him? Maybe. Am I convinced? Far from it. I think yeah. I mean, most likely suspect? Yes. Is it anywhere near enough to have him convicted? No, obviously not. Wrap up. And just like that, we've come to the end of our story, and once again, the ending is an unresolved one. As stated, despite the theories and the suspects, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run has never been officially identified, and neither have many of his victims. And to be frank, it's unlikely that we'll ever actually get any concrete answers as to who those people were, or who the man who took their lives most likely is. Official police reports on this case have been lost, destroyed, or removed, and there are those who think there are far more victims than the ones we know about. Some attribute the 9 murders classified as the Murder Swamp killings in Pennsylvania between 1921 and 1942 to belong to the Mad Butcher. Some say it was the butcher who killed and decapitated 41-year-old Robert Robertson in 1950, despite the cops treating it as a separate case. Hell, some even link the murder of the Black Dahlia to the Torso Killer. Just because someone else is cutting someone's head off doesn't mean it's the same guy. When you think about it, this case could be described as America's version of Jack the Ripper, a mysterious and monstrous killer unknown to this day, killing the down and out of society for unknown reasons. And that's the thing about this case. The mystery of his identity and motives will continue to intrigue and disturb for years to come. In the end, all we know is that between September 5th, 1934 and August 16th, 1938, a madman was on the loose, and at least 12 people were murdered because of it. Hell, we don't even know for certain that this was all caused by a single killer. All of these could be unrelated, and the handiwork of multiple killers, as unlikely as that may be. So it could be all a wild goose chase, and we'll simply never know. And to that, I want to end the scripts, like I always do, by remembering the victims, or at the very least the victims we can remember. Edward Anthony Andrassy, Florence Genevieve Polillo. Theirs are the only 2 victims whose names we know of, and that's a tragedy. All of the other victims were killed and dismembered, and their real names were forgotten by the world. I think back to the tattooed man. I think back to the Lady of the Lake and Rose Wallace and all the other John and Jane Does that were left in this monster's wake. They didn't deserve to die or be treated afterwards as they were. So if there is an afterlife, I hope they will rest in peace. Finally, dismembered appendices. Number 1. For those with good memories, we'd actually been to Cleveland once before in one of my scripts. Who remembers Anthony Sowell, aka the Cleveland Strangler? Quite a nasty piece of work he was, with a body count of 11 innocent women between May 2007 and September 2009. Thankfully, he was caught. But no spoilers, my friends. Go check out that previous video. Yes, please do, after this one, which ends in about 1 minute. 2. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run has also served as inspiration for a number of episodes in the hit TV show Criminal Minds. These episodes include the Season 2 2-part finale, No Way Out and No Way Out 2, The Evolution of Frank, Season 4's Zoe's Reprise, Season 8's The Fallen, Season 10's X, and Season 12's Taboo and A Good Husband. Good lord, Criminal Minds has been running for that long? Number 3. In 2018, a movie was released titled The Kingsbury Run. It must not have made too many waves since I had no idea that such a movie even existed, and it doesn't have its own Wikipedia page. Perhaps it has something to do with the fact that apparently it follows a modern copycat story of the murders, not the murders themselves, which would have been far more interesting in my opinion. Or maybe it was just an unnotable small movie that no one cares about because it was just a small movie. And that's where we end today's episode. Thank you for being here. I hope you found it interesting. If you're listening on Spotify or wherever you get your podcast, please do leave a rating or a review. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for being here.